Hello and back to the Tuesday afternoon radio show with your host, Randall Martin. So glad you can join us. And today we've got a lot of interesting guests as always. And we're going to return to find out what's happening in the courts. So we're going to speak to John Brigham, a voice that you've heard many times on this radio. He's a retired professor emeritus at Amherst College in Massachusetts. John, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks. I was at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
Oh,
sometimes
okay.
people want to make that distinction. It's fine. Thanks.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. And hey, your specialty, if you will, was in constitutional law, and you've spoken quite in depth and expertly about this in the past, and I keep looking at the court cases in reference to our current administration and thinking about what can be done. There's so many cases that have come up, and the Supreme Court just seems, and especially we've talked a lot about the power of the Supreme Court and versus the power of the presidency and how that's changed over time. What is your current analysis of kind of where we're at in America?
Thanks. I often described my work as constitutional law because that's what people understood. But I was in a political science department, so my real interest was in the political stature of the court and its readings of the Constitution relative to other people's, like the president or us, and how we see the Constitution. So that it's a take on constitutional law. Now we kind of think the lawyers will tell us what the Constitution means, or the courts. But that's what I was interested in. How did that come about? Because I think when the Constitution was written, it wasn't just supposed to be the lawyers or the courts. It was everybody that was supposed to be able to read it. That's why it was written in regular old English. And so that's what I've been up to. Yeah. Go ahead.
And has that been throughout the course of history, having other people being able to look at it and interpret it? But then ultimately, even though we can read it and interpret and say what we think it is as lay people in the public, is it not the Supreme Court that has the ultimate arbiter of what the Constitution can be interpreted as?
So that's what we're facing right now. I think there was an evolution in American history with the power of the court, just like there was with the power of the president. Both of them, I think, increased in significance from the original idea. And one of the things I point to is you go down to Washington, and it's the legislature's place, the Capitol that's on the Hill. And the court used to be in the basement of the Capitol, and the president was, down the road. And the legislature was what the Constitution created, and that's what they'd spend a whole lot of time creating. And now, when we think about what the Constitution means, we barely even think about the legislature and all the different Congress people when they're passing laws and when they're even just commenting on it. We think primarily of the Supreme Court. And now we're facing this issue where the president seems to have some different ideas about courts in general. So it's a really interesting time. It's a challenging time. I think it's a different time than we've been in for a while in terms of these issues.
Yeah, I think you put it very kindly when you say it's different ideas about the courts, and I think mainly it's to ignore those court rulings when they are not to his liking, and to enforce them every bit when they are something that he agrees with. But when we talk about the president's role morphing and changing in terms of how the historical norm was, and now we have a whole new paradigm where it is almost a relinquishing of the congressional duties here in deference to the president, and now it's really the president calling really all the shots, and the majority of the shots, since he has the majority for his party, and pretty much the Supreme Court really just signing on to whatever he says.
Well, in part, I think we're still a young country. I think we're still evolving, and this idea of the president's power has been not only evolving in real life, but the understanding of it and what it means and whether that's a good thing. And I remember even when I started 50 years ago teaching political science, people thought the president had to argue for things. He had to be
Mhm.
political in order to get anything done. He couldn't just announce the way the world he looked to him, and that was going to be the law. So this is a very different contemporary world using that power that's been built up. That's not new, but using it in a way that sort of with one man thinking he can just reinterpret all kinds of constitutional traditions.
Well, and hence the whole No Kings movement.
Yeah.
I think that's very contrary to the original ideas of the founders, who didn't want a monarch or a king or a dictator to be this authoritarian ruler over the country. And he had these, all of these co-equal, which was my thinking growing up, were co-equal sides of the government, which would be the courts and the legislatures, to put a check on those particular designs of having ultimate rule. But that system has failed. Is not only being unprecedented, but is there anything that the public, who's now been left out of this, has? And as you mentioned, we could read the Constitution and interpret it all we want, but in the current way that is playing out, we really don't have a voice, and the legislators, people that we've elected in our districts, don't really have voices either into changing the trajectory of what the president is doing, other than voting him out at the time in which that election occurs.
Well, if you take a Supreme Court case and say, what do the people say about it? It doesn't seem like we have much to say. They don't really they don't even look to political scientists. They look to lawyers and law faculty for that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look deeper into what we take to be how this country works, there are some things that still matter, like elections, the idea of elections. So the current president has sort of suggested maybe he'd want to stay in office for a while and not have elections, or just run in those elections even though he's not supposed to. But the public reaction even now on that is what I think you want to watch, because it's sort of subtle. It's like, wait a minute, it's a kind of like, I don't think you can do that. And another part of it is people in his own party are beginning to position themselves to run. So if they're positioning themselves to run, they're thinking there's going to be an election. So it's all those kinds of subtle ways in which the culture and the political arena have an expectation that is kind of how we assert our reading of the Constitution, our reading that you have elections every 4 years and the president only gets to be elected twice. And I mean, that matters. It's not a Supreme Court case yet, but it's the kind of public perception and sort of idea of how we do things that is being articulated now quietly, I think.
Well, and I agree. But we're looking at the current trends. If the president has his way and doing all these unprecedented things that have been coming up, this might very well be the case. And having the Supreme Court really be because of because of the types of majorities that are on the Supreme Court, and having, as that happens, I keep thinking to myself, was it a bad idea? I'm going to ask this question before I ask my other question, because it was coming up in my mind at the same time. Now, does it seem like it's a good idea to have Supreme Court appointments for life? Because before, when they were, quote unquote, apolitical, then you could have a independent check on power. Now that it's sort of doesn't seem to be challenging what the president has to say in the same ways that one would expect, those appointments for life now give a political entrenchment that has not been had, I think, in my understanding, for a long time. So now you have these, judicial political operatives on the Supreme Court, really helping the president to do what he wants. How do you
Yeah,
go back?
there's a number of aspects of that, and for recent history, they've been putting younger and younger people on, so that life is more significant, I think, from relatively early on, and then even
Right.
in the more recent periods, it was a senior person that was put on the Supreme Court as kind of an achievement, and that meant that they weren't going to be on even for life for very long, or like 20 years or so, as
Right.
opposed to potentially 40 or 50 years. And so they were less likely to be out of sync with the people in the political and legislative arenas. So that's one of the things that, yeah, we could think about. And I think it's reasonable to think about it. The size of the court has changed over time. The idea that it should have its own building that's a relatively new idea from the 30s, and lots of things have changed. And we could go to electing them or appointing them for a shorter period, or some people have said appointing non-lawyers, or some of them being non-lawyers and being distinguished citizens of some sort. All that seems worth talking about.
I agree, because I think that now I think where we find ourselves is this ideological block on the Supreme Court that is making decisions. And for me, from my outside perspective, giving legal cover and justification for actions that we would think would be challenged, and in other previous Supreme Courts would be challenged. So there's definitely, to me, a bias that is clear, and maybe there was always a bias, but I think this bias is very clear, and it is adding to the erosion of people's trust in the Supreme Court, as well as this trust
Yeah,
in the presidency and the legislature really doing that co-equal job of checking each other's power.
well, I haven't seen people writing about this thing that I want to throw in here from what you said, but it was last term of the year or so ago that the court gave the president this immunity from prosecution, and even just clarifying that may have influenced this particular term and this particular president, because it was always kind of out there. It wasn't clear whether you could prosecute a president or whether he was sort of above the law when he was doing official things. But then when the court made that decision, it kind of gave him an open opportunity to do things without even worrying about the law. And he clearly doesn't seem to be worrying about it. I mean, it seems like he wins some, lose some. He's going to do what he wants, and that may be something the court has already given him, which is scary.
Yeah, I think that you're starting to me to sort of bake in this this authoritarian framework in which you sort of have the Congress doing nothing but being obsequious to the president, and then you have a Supreme Court that is, in a way, co-signing a lot of these initiatives, and then you have a president who, that in any way, when he sees a dissenting opinion, even on the lower courts, he villainizes the judges, and he really tries to have all of these legal maneuvers to then still do what he wants to do, despite what the law says. And it really shows a disdain for anything that doesn't serve him and the people in the lower courts. And I think it really sets up, a very bad long-term future for the presidency and the Supreme Court. The legitimacy, I think, is
Well,
really,
yeah.
to me, in doubt. And to have people that are going to serve for life, that are going to be, these ideologues, really seems to be an outdated mode in light of what we're seeing today.
When you talk about having lots of different ways to constitute, to build a Supreme Court, that's sort of one angle on this. But another angle that you sort of suggest is the courts as courts the way we anticipated they were supposed to operate, reading the law, being narrow in what they fashioned for remedies, and limiting themselves to particularly clear legal opinions. And that world was a world that protected the judges from the threats in general, from the
Right.
threats of violence, from from having to it used to be from having to hide themselves. I mean, now they clearly are protected in a new way because the world has changed. With the reading of them as being more political has been a sort of scary reality for not just Supreme Court judges, but judges all the way down the line, who often in their robes they kind of hid out from the public. People didn't really know who they were, where they lived, and it wasn't as available as it is now, or meaningful.
Now, I want to explore this whole idea of immunity that you just brought up. And we know what the Supreme Court, or many should know, what the Supreme Court decided in terms of the president having a really broad range of immunity for actions that were deemed as part of his official actions. And now we've seen that extended, and extended on to even the ICE officers. Now they have immunity. This federalized immunity for doing whatever they do in the service of what the president has to say. And
well, you're quoting the vice president on that, right?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Well, because this is the thinking of the White House as expressed through,
right.
expressed through the vice president. And then I don't know about this, but does the Supreme Court have immunity for their decisions?
Well, they might, but they're not busting people's windows and going into people's houses. I mean, the vice president, one of the things that the legal community, I thought, did, it was react pretty dramatically about that claim that the vice president made, that's just bullshit. I mean, that's just not right. There's not an immunity for law enforcement. There's a kind of protection in official duties, but it's not an immunity that doesn't allow them to be held accountable for excesses that go beyond the obvious legal protections that we have. So I think, I mean, even it's going to be interesting whether the president, in terms of impeachment, because impeachment is the kind of thing that the Supreme Court was not really talking about. So you could still hold the president accountable for a series of violations or a series of judgments in terms of impeachment without I think, going up against that notion that he can't be legally prosecuted.
But to me, when you said, and there was the magic word there, where you said accountability, when you have immunity from prosecution, it really, to me, says it removes accountability for your actions, going forward, and especially to the public. And so public facing, you have now a clear path of sort of, again, an authoritarian sort of framework where the president has immunity / no accountability for what he does. Then you have a Supreme Court who is there on there for life, and there's no real path to say, since they may enact and help build their framework, they're not actually doing the actions. So they really have a sort of immunity for the decisions that they're making, whether right or wrong, and even if it goes against long-term established precedent. And then you have now law enforcement. In this particular case, we're talking about ICE. And again, this is, as you mentioned, this is the vice president saying this, who's saying, in his viewpoint, the laws, our law enforcement apparatus, his now, I'll term it as the Gestapo, his private little army there, they have immunity. And then you have the Congress on the other side, and the Senate really saying nothing. Like, where we know their hands are tied, and we're going to work at the service of the president. And so you really have zero accountability, and all those judges on the lower courts that are making decisions that are not favorable and fighting the good fight are now really being vilified, and their lives put in danger because they're making decisions that go against the grain of what the president's goal, which seems to me to be ultimate power. And so, how do you now handle that? Because now, I mean, if I'm a judge and I have a decision before me, I can either vote the right way or vote my conscience, or I have to face the wrath of much of the nation and the federal apparatus that has been weaponized against dissenters.
Well, I don't want to just look too much to the future. But I already suggested this jockeying for being a candidate for president, just the quiet positioning themselves of Marjorie Taylor Greene and people like that is a kind of way to look forward in this situation. And because clearly yeah, you're absolutely right. Right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of pushback from the Congress or all those pushback from the people of Minnesota or Minneapolis, just spectacular pushback that needs to be historically recognized, and yet the real pushback is in the march to the next elections, the movement to all the little steps that we take to those elections, both to protect that they happen, but also to have people coming out. Because I think if you had a more vibrant Congress, I guess that means democratic control, but even if it just suggested that all the parties might look to people in addition to the president of the United States for guidance and how to move, we might have some real excitement. And one of the things that I wonder about is whether a focus on impeachment, spending, if we do take the Congress, spending 2 years of struggling over that, how much that makes sense, or even if you could get Donald Trump out of the White House, whether that would be a positive thing or whether just prolong the right wing power over that institution with the younger person coming in. So, I mean, all this future stuff is, I guess, what I have to hope for, and even as an aspect of the No Kings, the rallying and the public condemnation of what's going on, and the people of Minnesota, it's going to be over long term that is its consequences are read out, and whether it does have a meaning for the election of a Congress and even for what the courts do over time, whether that kind of publicity could give the courts pause and change some of the ideological orientation of the people in the institution.
Well, I always want to fall on the optimistic perspective, but as many of our viewers know, on WGXC here, I coin myself as a pragmatist, and so I look at what's happening and try to make decisions in the future. I think based on the available information, even though I like to think that take an overall optimistic view. And to what you said, I don't know if having Marjorie Taylor Greene run for president, much less be president, is a very preferable thing. But I do see that, like you said, there are cracks in that wall that seems to be forming. But when we look at, again, let's shift back to Congress, because Congress, to me, were the people that held the hands on the purse and the purse strings, and they can while they make laws, they could also be a check to power for the president by defunding certain things. And again, all has been flipped on its head. Now the Congress is really not making, I don't even know what laws they're making that are good laws, other than trying to repeal the environmental laws that were keeping us safe. But and I think that was not even Congress. That was actually the EPA through Lee Zeldin, who ran for office here. But I think that what we're seeing is this whole retrenchment, and I want to talk to you about, when I look at the laws, again, of the lower courts and what they're upholding, it seems to me that one of the other frightening aspects of this administration is that they are not really competent in the courts. And you see all of these, I forget her name, that the people that they were installing as attorney generals that were unqualified and getting run out of the courts. The lady in Jersey. I mean, I would think that the pushback could be more effective, because I feel like we know the law, the actual law, what it's supposed to be. And when you do take them to court and apply it, most people end up victorious. But it seems that in the bigger scope of things, that's not happening enough. So I think that they just try this overreach, and see what sticks. But it seems that when the legal community pushes forward and says, that's not right, let's put this to the test, their tactics are not really competent, and all they do is delay the system of judgment. But it seems a way to not let them get away with this huge overreach is the courts. But can the courts really stand? And as you said, we're a new country, so not a new country, but we're not very old in historical terms. Can our courts withstand the likes of a Trump and his authoritarian impulses, and give us somewhat of a wall of sanity that doesn't allow this overreach? Can this happen? I think we're better at it. I think we're better at looking at the laws, interpreting the laws, and going out there. Can that bulwark against this tyranny be successful?
So you're prompting me to try and give examples of some optimism, and they're so small that I'm a little concerned. But one of them is that very notion that these people are incompetent. Now we get that because the reporting is on their incompetence, and the judges are holding them incompetent, and it's a much more positive thing than it seems, because it just seems like they have been choosing the elite people, or people that really know what they're doing. And the scary part would be if we weren't aware of it. I mean, we're aware of it now. It's talked about. It seems to be important. I mean, there are some new. I try and watch some of the other side's news stories, and they tend not to emphasize that kind of judgment. But it's very prominent now in terms of lots of the court cases, lots of the arguments, lots of the credentials, many of the instances of uncredentialed or marginally credentialed people. We're still able, I think, to make judgments about capacity and talent and good arguments. So I think that's hopeful. I think there is some hope in that, and I don't think it's only progressive people that notice, because I think the way these people are presented and the lack of credentials and the mistakes they make in arguments are all chronicled and going to be around for lots of people to see over time.
I agree, and I think that may be, in the sort of idea of civil society, that may be the only way that we can really start to gain back the system in the way that it seemingly was intended to work. But I think that we're actually looking at this new emerging type of America, the way we're perceived around the world, the way we're perceived internally within the nation, the way we perceive what leaders should or should not be doing. And I think that it's probably not going to go back to the other way. And putting on your political science hat, are there opportunities now to change America for the better? I mean, these are dark days in terms of the general framework of democracy that we've come to know, and America's always been imperfect, to be clear, in many ways. But is there a way, when you look at this democracy as well as democracies around the world, and how republics function, is there a way that we could come out of this better? Okay, can we exercise the demons of autocracy and get that out of there, and then come to a point that's even better than where we were? Is it possible?
So you had me thinking about where in American life is a positive resistance, and it's a stretch. It's a little bit about the future, but now you've just shifted in an interesting way to the international take on what the United States is doing. So one possibility is that just as we read the lack of talent and preparation and intelligence in some of the people that are put forward in the American chronicle of what's happening, there is that international sense that things are a little bit crazy over here in the United States. And so to deal with your question is kind of, will that matter? I mean, does it matter what the rest of the world thinks? And I got to think it does matter in terms of economies, in terms of technology, in terms of even travel. I mean, where can you go? If if the perception that you're the good guys changes, then you really can't show your face various places, or at least not without taking a lot of shit for it. And I think that's optimistic. I mean, that the Greenland thing, I mean, there's not much optimistic about the president threatening to take Greenland. But one thing that is optimistic is the international response, or at least the European response. Like, what are you talking about? How can you can't do that kind of thing? And it's hopeful, I think. And from Canada over to Europe, those articulate engagements with the United States, I think, have to matter. Now, some people are just going to turn that off and say, I don't care what the rest of the world thinks. But the rest of the world is still fairly substantial and still matters. So I think that's one other place for looking for hope.
Well, as you were mentioning that, it made me think about there are things that as we evolve, because this is evolution. It may be this particular part of the evolution is not a good phase of it, but maybe there are things from Europe and Canada, Canadian sort of societies that maybe we will adopt after this. Maybe after looking at this disastrous period of time, we will look and say maybe we will want universal health care, or maybe we will want some of these other things, because at the same time as all this happens, and this really frightens me, we are ignoring the AI revolution that is happening all around us and the resulting displacement that will happen. So society is changing politically here, but I think because of that, and as for me as a technologist, I'm looking and saying, well, there's a whole nother side of this that's going to be a huge disruption on this side. No one's really talking about that, and its impact on the governments and people, and the amount of people that are going to be put out of work. And meanwhile, I think that what this government is doing in many ways is it's reducing our competitiveness around the world. I mean, tourism was a huge thing. And if you look from the North Country to Florida, we've killed, not we, the president has killed tourism because, as you said, people don't want to come here. They don't want to trade with you. If you're a pariah state or nation, people don't want to visit you. People don't want to buy your products, so it reduces your ability to transact a business and bring in a new business and fix your economy. And so maybe we will now, after again looking at this, maybe there will be a feeling of we do have to make changes, but we have to make changes that are people centered and not oligarchy centered like you do over in Russia and then in many other places. And when you talked about all the good groups that are out there, I mean, and you talked about Michigan a couple of times, that disruption of sort of their daily lives, I think, is coming here because one of the things that was in the paper yesterday is that ICE has bought a huge warehouse in upstate New York, somewhere here in the Hudson Valley. And I believe that they're pulling people from there. And New York may be next. Well, it's probably going to be somewhere down the line of having almost a Michigan-style invasion here. And I start to think, and again, we talk about like the no kings and things like that. I start to think, what are people going to do here? How are people going to react to that kind of thing right in your face? I mean, most people are wanting, and I know I'm making a turn, a left turn over here, if you will. But people, want immigration reform, right? People don't want people that have been actively doing crime or committed of serious crimes in the country. But it seems to me that no one is agreeing on the kinds of things that is happening here in terms of kidnapping people and mass soldiers on the streets without any identification, doing any number of things that most of these people untrained or barely trained or poorly trained and not vetted.
So
Do you
you
think?
do what?
Go ahead.
Well, so you do want to watch to see if it's going to be the same all over again. I mean, that Minnesota in invasion, and whether that's going to that would happen in New York, or whether they would learn something from the past. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether New York State or the city could or would react quite that way. There was something almost homey. I mean, like Midwestern about the reaction in Minnesota that was so incredible and so exciting. And I like to think that we could do the same and respond in the same way. But that makes you wonder whether they would actually engage in the same fashion, the federal government. So I mean, that's about whether we would react the same way or differently. Now with the ICE prisons, we have this tradition in upstate New York of taking prisons wherever we can get them, and I think that's unfortunate. So maybe, and again, that maybe there could be some resistance because it's an ICE prison, because it's not going to bring in the sort of prison tourism and people coming to see their family in jail. I mean, who knows what the reaction is, but there is clearly some reaction against those prisons being placed anywhere in the country, and them that ICE being able, with this massive amount of money, being able to buy up warehouses is one thing. Being able to convince the local community that what they want to do with that warehouse is imprison people from other countries. It's going to be an interesting struggle. Yeah.
As he marches toward his retribution tour, it may include people here. And I bring this up to say that these events are I think marching on. It's not like this is ending. And Holman, their new face of ICE, has said that they're not really backing down. They're just shifting fronts. And now,
so we'll see whether they try and do it in the same way, or whether they shift at all. I mean, because they clearly shifted some, and that they didn't amplify it. They didn't just take they didn't call it a success in Minnesota and then move right on to Chicago. So there's some hope that there'll be a positive reaction to that disaster in January. What we've been facing.
Well, political science can public resistance help a situation like this? Will there be like a Tiananmen Square sort of moment, which
Well, maybe Minnesota was that moment. Maybe Minneapolis was that dark moment in January when we're even here we were freezing to death, much less compared to what they were dealing with up there, and the reaction is likely to be different. I mean, I think ICE is right now, they don't have funding. So that's incredibly positive.
Yes.
They changed in the last couple of hours. But, recently, in the last couple hours ago, they weren't being funded. So even if they do get some funding, the resistance was there. It showed up to some extent, as opposed to Congress doing nothing. So that's optimistic.
So I think what I'm hearing you say, in that despite all the challenges that we have, that public social resistance showing up and en masse and saying we are not for this, we are not going to support these actions. We're not going to allow these illegal, immoral, dubious policies to take place and take hold in our area. That is, when it really comes down to it, that is the most significant way that the public can then show that we are not supporting your policies. Am I interpreting that right?
No, I think that's incredibly important. I think we should, as we hopefully come out of the winter, that's a positive thing about this darkness that we saw. I mean, the darkness of what the federal government did in Minnesota and the incredible resistance to it. is going to be part of that story. It's got to be part of that story, whether or not you look to a success or a change policy. That resistance is an example of mass mobilization against a police state, or against the kind of policing that they were doing, as something that just is not American. I mean, I don't know how you can tell the story of January in Minneapolis as a story of American successes, mass success there, and the failure of the resistance. It's got to be the other way around. I mean, the masked men are not the good guys in that. I don't think it's just me. I think historically it's hard to imagine that being told as a success of federal power. And I'll tell you, one of the things that, as a political scientist in the last 50 years, federal power was always presented as like a positive thing. I mean, almost always in national politics. Maybe it wasn't presented positively in the American South a while back, but for most of American political science and the teaching of which level of government was the good guys, the federal decisions on civil rights colored the whole story, and that's not the whole story. That's one story. That's a story that we can tell separately from this current one, where the federal government is not the American institution that the people of Minnesota represented. I think it's un-American.
Right. This turns the civil rights movements and other movements on their head. It is the exact opposite. It's the federal government that's the villain, that's saying, you will do what I say, and you will obey, or you'll pay the price with your life. And so many things have happened in there where if you film me, if you try to exercise any level of accountability, I was saying, I'm going to film you, I'm going to follow you, I'm going to see, people have paid for that with their lives. And people's lives have been interrupted. And I say that, this may indeed come here, and people have to be prepared. I think that this administration is really, in many ways, about that shock factor, that fear, creating terror, keeping people off balance. And they use sort of these sort of populist ideas of, again, immigration and all these other issues and the failings in immigrations of past administrations, but then to go on and do something wholly and completely immoral about it. So I think that we do have to organize. People do have to be on the sort of local level, just really out there and visible and talking about what's happening, urging and girding up their Congress people, their local officials to say, hey, I need you to go out there and defend our democracy. We put you there. You have to put a tent pole there to say, on our behalf, that we won't allow these incursions to happen, and we won't go quietly. And
Yep. But another slightly different angle is, what if they come, or we should maybe look at slightly different, rather than the masked ICE people in New York. There's other things going on, and I was fascinated by the prosecution of Maduro in New York. I couldn't figure out why the federal government was bringing this guy to New York, and then I linked that up to the Luigi Mangione prosecution also in New York. And there are these federal activities in New York without the mask. Well, they have their own version. I mean, the federal power used to take the leader of another country and bring him to New York City for prosecution is something to sort of weigh in a similar but different way from what happened in Minnesota. There, the federal government, if anything, I mean, there were massive amounts of people, but those masked guys, I mean, historically, they're not going to be as I said before, the heroes of that story. But the federal government is also doing the same thing. I mean, it's doing a similar power grab in New York, where it's prosecuting people that, I mean, very strange kind of prosecutions of a national leader, and also a crime, a murder that took place on the streets of New York is being prosecuted federally in part because there's a death penalty with the federal government, but also it's a way of showing the federal power in New York. So maybe it's going to be shown in a different way in New York.
Interesting.
That made it possible.
I never thought about that. My take was that having him prosecuted in New York and also having the United Nations in New York, it was a sign to the world that I can reach you. As he says, to quote, we can touch you no matter where you are. And if we are displeased with you as a leader, we're going to forcibly render you back to the United States to face our version of justice. But mainly that justice is meted out to people who don't toe the line of the federal, federal dictates.
Well, it did that. You're right. It did that, but it also is an example of a federal reach that's further than we've traditionally accepted. At least in the case of Maduro, the case of Mangione, I think that's not all that unusual, but it is dramatic that when you prosecute a murder in one jurisdiction where you can be executed for it, as opposed to another where you can't be executed. That's a big deal, and it does say something about how powers, and that may not even be a plan. They may not be planning it that way, but the federal power there looks more untouchable than the power in Minnesota, which looked like it could be resisted. I mean, it was huge amount of force, but the masked, in many senses, the masked enforcement seemed impotent. I mean, like they had to wear masks because they didn't have the authority. I mean, the masks were a kind of negative, and historically, I think they'll be looked at negatively. So we'll see whether federal government will assert its power in different ways, more subtle ways, less easily challenged ways in the near future.
Well, I think as we're winding down to the top of the hour, we're going to get ready to take a break. The station's going to be on, and they're going to give you some announcements as usual. And you're listening to WGXC. This is the Tuesday afternoon radio show with your host, Randall Martin. I'm speaking to the great John Brigham, and so political science professor, retired emeritus, and we're really kind of chopping it up about sort of what's happening. And I think sort of to sum it up in the top of the hour, I think people have to be vigilant. People can't normalize this. And I think that people have to come out, join these protests, be part of the change that you want to see, because I think these overreaches are very, very serious. And we have to take them into the context in which they are. And this is not normal. None of this is normal. So I think I think that we really have to understand the moment that we're in and react appropriately. And I think about my kids, and I want my kids to grow up in a freer society than even the one that we had. And so that's looking maybe questionable at the moment, but we're not done. You know, the country's not done. We're not done yet. So 30 seconds, John. Any final comments before we conclude this interview? But we would definitely have you back. Love your perspective. What do you think? 30 seconds.
Great to talk to you. Thanks a lot. You make me optimistic. I don't know what it is about the way you talk, the way you think, but and maybe it's springtime. I'm feeling optimistic that there's a reason that we're going to remember some of those struggles of the winter in a positive way. We came through it, and we're likely to be able to change in a positive direction. So thanks very much for having me.
You're very, very welcome. And I'm going to end this segment again. Stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. But remember, the people united will never be defeated. This is Randall Martin for the Tuesday Afternoon Radio Show. You're very welcome, and we'll be right back.